Hey, that feels pretty good. And I didn't even say anything yet. I'm a family scientist. And some people kind of look funny when I say that. But I get in my work to study the most interesting, most complex, most strange, weird, and wonderful critter on the planet called the American family. And in my work, we look at systems, and we look at trends, and we look at things like how natural occurrences and changes over time affect families, and particularly in my work, I look at how it, in the context of family, how it affects children, and particularly adolescents. And I have to tell you, as a researcher, I'm deeply concerned. But as a father, I'm scared to death. I see a fundamental change in our children that is critical. I think we have in this country, and have been developing over time, a civility crisis. I believe that we are raising children who have a compassion deficit. And if we don't speak and act and rally as parents and teachers and researchers and community members, that we may lose the very foundation of our nation. In my work, I was thinking the other day, do you remember a couple of years ago, there was yet another epidemic scare? It was, I can't remember if it was the bird flu or the pig flu, but we were worried about some animal flu that was going to invade all of us and change our lives forever. And that those concerns got so severe that we were screaming at the federal government to stockpile medicines. People were marching onto airplanes with masks. Parents were keeping their children home from school. We were screaming and yelling for something to be done about this epidemic that would destroy us. What if we had an epidemic that we've known about for at least 30 years? That we've tried to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at this epidemic, and nothing has stopped it? What if this epidemic would affect, according to a couple of groups that don't usually exaggerate, the Center for Disease Control and the U.S. Department of Education, what if this epidemic were going to affect 30 to 50% of our school-age children in the United States this school year? Wouldn't you all be screaming and up in arms? What if you knew about this epidemic, that it, in its mildest form, would cause 189,000 school children to stay home from school on Monday, would cause another 169,000 children to bring a weapon to school, that in its mildest forms, children would feel anxious and depressed, but in its most radical forms, it would cause hospitalization, severe stress, including heart disease and other illness, and such severe stress that it would evolve into post-traumatic stress syndrome, suicide, and death. Wouldn't we be outraged and alarmed? That epidemic is what I call the meanness epidemic. And it's not new, certainly. But I want to tell you about some fundamental changes that I see from my perspective in our education system and in our community values and morals that have changed the way that our children act. Just a few generations, not that long ago, this was a school very much like the one I went to. And these schools are rotting everywhere across our landscape. Not all of them are in prairies like that one. That happens to be one in my state of Kansas. But some of these were in the center of our cities in New York and Boston. They were the neighborhood schools. They were the small, caring, sometimes K through 12 in one building schools that fostered what Benjamin Franklin hoped would be a nation of civility. At a school much like this, every morning in my K through 12 career, I would meet someone like Ukayla Deloach. Ukayla would meet every student at the door of the building. And the first thing that she would do is give us one heck of a big hug. And she'd just hold us there in that bear hug, you know. And it didn't matter if we were this tall or this tall. She'd hug us because she knew that some of us needed that hug before we could learn. And then Miss Deloach, she would ask us 3 questions. And I think if we asked every child in our community these 3 questions every day, that we could begin to subside this epidemic. She would, while she had us there, by the way, she was a multitasker. While she had us there in that big hug, she'd check our head for lice, you know. And then she'd say, first question, did you have any breakfast? Did you have any breakfast? And some of you might think, what does that have to do with STEM scores and science scores and math scores? But we know from our research, it's quite clear what Ukayla Deloach knew way back then, that a child who has not eaten properly will not perform well on test scores. The second question, though, was one that grew out of love and trust and kindness and compassion. She would look us right in the face, and I'll never forget that big, beautiful face. We were all in love with her, you know, and she would look at us and say, how are you feeling? And we knew that meant 2 things to Miss Deloach. We knew we'd better answer it 2 ways. The first was, how are you feeling physically? Because she knew a child that was sick, that was hurting, could not perform well. But we also knew that we better tell her how we were feeling up here, because she knew that a child who was suffering, a child who had been mercilessly harassed on a bus for 30 minutes before they got to school, a child who'd been put down and called sped or other names, farm trash or other names before they got to school, could not learn. And we'd answer her because we trusted her and she modeled compassion for us. We would answer with total honesty. The third question was this: is there anything that you need to help you learn today? In a time when many of our taxpayers are saying, don't fund our schools, we need to remember the sacrifice that Ukayla Deloach made every day, and that teachers all over this country make every day. They reach into voluminous purses to pull out everything a child is going to need to learn. And we knew that meant anything from another hug to some cereal to a pencil to write with or a pad of paper, and Ukayla would get it for us. But a fundamental change happened while I was in school. We, during a tough economic time like we're in now, when we make decisions that are not based on the future, we decided that the way to improve our school system and to save money was to consolidate. So I found myself going from a school like this, full of love and compassion, to a school that looked like this. And this is where many of our kids will reside, most of our kids, every day. Up in the corner, at the top in the left there, you'll see a row of trailers. Those trailers were places where kids like I spent much of our educational career. See, I didn't like this place. I didn't thrive in this place. I became a number and not a child. And so as a reward for my disdain, distrust, and anger and fear about this place, they put me in that trailer that had a wheelchair ramp going into it. And the day I walked in there in trouble to go into that trailer, I read 4 letters over the door. 4 letters that profoundly affect me every time I speak. SPED, SPED. And that means that my life changed forever as I became labeled as a SPED. I won't go into it, but I do want to tell you the worst part of my school day in that building, in a building like that, was at 12:30 when the teacher in the trailer would put a ship's rope outside that trailer and lay it on the ground. And there were 30 of my SPED brothers and sisters thrown together in this trailer, some of them with things that I didn't understand. As a professor, I certainly understand now, but things like cerebral palsy and microcephaly and hydrocephaly and various forms of what we call developmental disabilities. And there were children with emotional problems, and then there were screw-ups like me, and they would throw us all together in this trailer, and then at 12:30, she would roll out this rope, and it had 36 handles in it, and she'd tell us to grab that rope, and each of those handles had a name on it. We had to lead the blind children and take the children in wheelchairs and make sure they got lined up. If we didn't do that, in about 7 minutes, she'd hit our wrist with a ruler, and then she would march us. All 30 of us, leading the SPED parade. She would march us into a cafeteria filled with 800 to 1,000 students eating lunch. And then it came, SPED! Look at the SPEDs! And they'd throw pizza and peas and kick us. They'd pull that rope to watch us fall over like bowling pins. They'd spit on us. And I could take all that. I was tough. The thing I couldn't take is that not one of those children, not one of those teachers, not one of those people ever asked me to sit at their table. I want to say something to you before I go any further. I have to say it, I'm sorry. You better be darn careful how you treat us weirdos. You know, us kids who have disabilities, us kids who are too fat, us kids who are too quiet, us kids who are too small or aren't developing quick enough, us kids who are the wrong color or the wrong socioeconomic status. You better be damn careful how you treat us. Do you know why? We come back to haunt you. Now students at the university pay hundreds of dollars to hear what I have to say. See? So I got even. In 2010, we passed the best bullying law in the nation right here in New Hampshire. We passed it because of the courage of many people. But how did we get into this mess? How did we get into this compassionless generation? I mean, the indicators are everywhere. If you look, you will see that our children have a greater sense of entitlement. One of our researchers at my university found that out, that the children in school today have a greater sense of entitlement of any group that's come before them. In my own research, we gave tests to New England's 7th graders, something called an empathy scale. We tested about 300 of them in our state. And this was part of a project called the Courage to Care, in which I and a group of my colleagues are trying to change the world by teaching compassion in the classroom. And we found on those empathy scales a very worthy test that was written in Britain and has been used around the world, has great validity. We found that 7th graders in one of the richest states and the richest nation on earth scored lower in 3 types of compassion than children in China, Afghanistan, Japan, and around the world. In 9 weeks, we were able to change that. And we did it by asking the children a fundamental question. What kind of village do you want to live in? I'll show you just a piece of how we asked that question. Before I show you this short video, we start each of the 9 lessons in teaching compassion in the Courage to Care Project. We start each of the 9 lessons by giving the kids what we call a video jolt. We learned that if you're going to engage 7th grade girls, you better get them emotional. And if you're going to engage 7th grade boys, you better have an activity, as our previous speaker was saying. And so that's what we decided to do when we studied how 7th graders learn. So here's in the new, unusual, student-led compassion classroom. Here's the question that the teacher would pose by playing this video. We're not having sound, but you hear the sound of a child sobbing. That's it. So the question the teacher asks is, what is your responsibility? What would you do? And it's interesting to watch the seventh graders decompress. They began to say things like, well, I'm not sure that you'd want to poke the bear. I'm not sure that you'd want to go there. I'm not sure that she'd want you to go there. But people who were raised in my school, in my generation, I think differently. This is the fundamental evidence that something's gone wrong. Every year in the United States and in almost every state, we ask high school students a group of questions. It's a research project called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's conducted under the auspices of the Center for Disease Control. And over the years, they started out just looking at our HIV and AIDS education and drug risk education, how we were doing. But over the years, we've snuck some questions into this survey. Here's one of the questions from the most recent survey in 2011 in the United States. They asked this question of high school students. Almost every day, how many have you ever felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row so that you stopped doing some usual activities during the 12 months before you took this survey? The results make me very sad. If you look at the totals there, it's about almost 30% of our kids said they felt so sad or hopeless in the last 12 months for 2 weeks or more. And if you look at the females, they're almost at 40% in some of the grades. Here's another question that's on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that I've been paying attention to. The number of students who feel, when asked, that they don't matter to people in their community. Overall, that is 51% of our high school students in this country. Is this the village that we want to live in? So, how did this come about? How did it work? In the center, you'll see a brochure that I wrote for the university called Understanding Bullying. I wrote this in my work for cooperative extension for the university to share, as the blue-collar scholar that I am, to try and share and make palatable the research we were doing at the university. It became the largest distributed publication in the history of my university. Why? Because everyone recognizes this. But to find the roots of this dilemma in kindness and compassion that we're facing, I think one has to go back to David Elkind, who wrote a book back in the 80s. And many of the parents here and many of the scholarly types here will remember The Hurried Child. Dr. Elkind warned us way back that if we don't pay attention to our children's social and emotional learning, at the same time we were trying to accelerate. Do you remember what we've been through? I mean, the parenting of the 80s and 90s where we dropped 3 months old into the water and said swim because it was the right thing to do. We sent our children to La Fufu Petite Academy instead of mom and pop's childcare, where we elevated children to gymboree and jamboree instead of just playing in the neighborhood. And the result has been what Dr. Elkind warned over 30 years ago, that we have a generation who excels in almost everything except compassion and getting along. The other thing that we've learned is from a group of positive psychologists represented by the book on the right called Character, Strength, and Virtues. Dr. Seligman and Dr. Peterson have redone the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And instead of saying, here's how everybody's sick in the world, they said, what would it take to be a whole middle schooler? What would it take to be whole? And so we based our work on that. And I'm happy to tell you today that when you teach empathy, when you focus in the classroom systematically to teach empathy to our children, and the signs of empathy, which we identify as caring and kindness, as practicing random acts and beauty. The themes that you've heard all of the speakers talk from today: civility, mindfulness, courage, and power. If you can put those into 9 lessons and begin to teach them, you can change the world. Franklin said, when he founded a little program that was his pet project, Benjamin Franklin's pet project for the country, was a little program he called the high school. Isn't that a wonderful thing? It sounds like high tea, the high school. And he said the purpose for the high school will be to teach civility and compassion, because without them, our democracy cannot work. I think this is the case for compassion. Thank you.